Hello, and welcome to James and the Frames. I'm your host, James, and here I talk about some of the greatest frames ever filmed while discussing film-related topics with you guys. And this is our 19th episode, and I'm really super excited to talk about one of my favorite films of 2019. It's up in the top 3. The 2019 film, The Lighthouse. Written by Max Eggers and Robert Eggers and directed by Robert Eggers, it stars Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson as two lighthouse keepers who are stranded on an island when a devastating storm hits. Soon the two men realize that they may very well be going mad together. Well, guys, this is the first time in a while that I'm going to do this, but spoiler alert for The Lighthouse for the entire episode. I'm sorry, I want to dedicate a segment where there isn't spoilers, but I just can't with The Lighthouse, even in the Q&As, because this is a film that affected me probably the most out of 2019. The one that kept me thinking long after the credits started rolling, and the film that just blew me away. It blew me away. So full spoiler alert for The Lighthouse. I will be talking in depth for the entire episode. But for those who have not seen The Lighthouse, I will still give a small spoiler-free review right now, so you guys can just listen to this real quick. This film is flawless in pretty much every aspect. There's outstanding black and white cinematography. There's outstanding performances. Willem Dafoe probably gives his career best performance in this movie. It has amazing direction by Robert Eggers, and it's just really well done. It's a very well made film, and I'm gonna leave it at that for the spoiler free. Sorry guys, but if you've not seen The Lighthouse, do not continue beyond this point because I'm going in depth in 3, 2, 1. So guys, this film blew me away. I've said it before, but it blew me away. Robert Eggers has delivered his best work since The Witch. The Witch is amazing, but this director continues to impress me, and he's becoming one of my favorite directors ever. Him and Ari Aster are basically the Spielberg and Lucas in terms of new filmmakers and new creative styles and way of telling stories. These two directors know what they're doing. And Eggers really showcases his skill and love and passion for filmmaking in The Lighthouse. It has outstanding direction by him. Outstanding. This film has been studied upon a lot. There is so much care that has been put into this project, into this story. Even the dialogue, Max Eggers and Robert Eggers, the two brothers who wrote this film, they actually went and researched how lighthouse keepers in the late 19th century used to communicate with one another and how they used to talk and stuff like that. They basically incorporated that into the dialogue, like sailor talk and all that. It's not really sailor talk, but it's more like a combination of sailor talk and old English, New England grammar. And with the dialogue and with the way it sounds, the acting in this film is some of the best acting I've ever seen. Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe, this duo on screen, it's iconic. I really think this is the best film that they've done so far in their respective careers. I mean, Willem Dafoe gives his best performance to date. It's a very memorable one. He does such a good job. He completely immerses himself into the role. And there's scenes where I couldn't see Willem Dafoe, where I could see this old Ahab-looking sea captain, lighthouse keeper. And there was times where Willem Dafoe would pop out and you'd recognize his style, but my goodness, Willem Dafoe picks the right people to work with. He worked with Lars von Trier with Antichrist, and he did a great performance there. And now he's working with Robert Eggers. Apparently, what he did is that he sent a letter to Robert Eggers after seeing The Witch, and he wanted to work with Robert Eggers. So Eggers cast him into this role. And this role is pretty much perfect for him. He's basically an old, kooky, sea captain-like character that's just so entertaining to watch. He really embraces his craft here. And I can't talk about Willem Dafoe without mentioning Robert Pattinson. This is his greatest performance I've seen from him. He has done some great films in the past few years. A Good Time And he was also in High Life, and he gave a fantastic performance in that film too. And I'm so glad he's getting the recognition he deserves, because this man is a very, very talented actor. Like Willem Dafoe, he completely immersed himself into this role. Down to the accents and everything, he really shows off his acting chops in this film. And from these two actors, there's just some monologues in this film that just leave you mesmerized. More so on the part of Willem Dafoe, because he really went full on Captain Ahab. I keep referencing Captain Ahab, but that's the best comparison I can do. There's a specific monologue in this film where Winslow, or Thomas, we'll talk about that in a second, played by Robert Pattinson, basically goes on some rant against Willem Dafoe, and basically upsets his character. There's the famous "what" scene, of course, where it's like, what, 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 and it's an incredible scene. It goes from that sequence to, "You're not fond of me lobster, ain't you?" And it kind of goes from there into one of the best monologues I've seen ever. Willem Dafoe just oozes pure intensity and realism, and most important of all, character. He plays this role so incredibly well, and that 3 or so minute monologue just had my jaw on the floor, because he just has some of the best lines in this film, and his presence is just such a dominating presence. Of course, there's fart jokes in this film that's played off as like a gag, but you could also see it as him being the more dominant role, from farting in front of Winslow because, well, I can do this and you can, and it's kind of my area, and I'm just kind of marking my territory, or however you want to say it. But I can't emphasize enough how well Willem Dafoe played this role. He just gives the best performance from an actor in basically in 2019, and the best performance I've seen in a long time from an actor. And I'll circle back one more time with Robert Pattinson and saying he really embraces his role too, because as we learn little hints about Winslow or Thomas's past, we are kind of told through his facial expressions what's true and what's really not, and what really personally affects him and what really doesn't affect him. And when he wants to go insane, man, he really goes insane. Same with Willem Dafoe. Best performances I've seen in a while. Alright, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technical aspects of this film, and then I'll jump into the story aspects, the ending, the character progression, the tone. I'm going to talk about all that. I just gotta say, the cinematography is... I don't know what to say. The cinematography is nothing short of mesmerizing. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing his name right. I think it's Jared Pulaski. He just does an amazing job. There's just impeccable framing and camera movements, and the lighting. Don't even get me started on the lighting, because for one, this film was shot, I think, entirely on 16mm black and white film. And for those of you who don't know, when they filmed these scenes with that format, they had to make the scenes a lot more brighter to compensate for the negatives in the film they were using, I believe. So, for most of the scenes, it looks like it's very dimly lit, and it's just done so well. But in real life, the light, according to Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe, was almost blinding for them to work in, so it's kind of a fourth wall break there, because the light was that bright. It was enchanting. I'm kidding. But the lighting is just impeccable, and the use of shadows and contrasts is really well done, because there are parts of this film where it gets very dark, but you can just barely make out what's going on. A couple scenes I can recall is when you see Winslow or Thomas outside of the boiler room, I think, where he goes to shovel coal, and there's a couple sequences where he walks out and has a smoke, and you can only really see the whites of his eyes. Now, I don't know if that was my TV settings, because I have my TV settings, pretty good in terms of contrast and lighting, but you could only see the whites of his eyes and just a little bit of his physical appearance. But to accomplish that is just... it's just amazing. And again, going back to shadows and contrasts, there's scenes in this film where the sides of the frame itself get so dark, it looks like it's an entire 16 by 9 shot. It looks like it's not even in 4:3, or not even 4:3 Academy aspect ratio, and it's not even Academy aspect ratio, it's some other format that's very similar to Academy aspect ratio. But those types of scenes as well, one in particular that I can recall is when Winslow, or Thomas, is getting the shackles off of the roof, and he peeks in through a hole in the roof, and you can kind of just see the hole where his eye is, and to the sides of the frame, it's completely dark. So you can just make up your own aspect ratio from that shot, and I find that very creative. And that's another thing about this film. It's very, very creative. It does a lot of really cool things in terms of camera work, first of all, and cinematography, and even in the sound design. Sound plays such a fundamental part in this film. I highly recommend watching this film with a high volume, because there are a lot of tiny elements to the sound design in this film that just breathe life into this atmosphere. And to quote Robert Eggers, it's a crusty, dusty, musty atmosphere that's just so detailed in terms of the dark, gritty cinematography. And then the impeccable sound design where rain pattering down and just wind noises just make up for an incredible immersive world. And if I ever get the chance to see this film in a theater someday, I will. Because goodness my, the sound design is just amazing. Now, of course, while talking about sound, I also have to jump into the score. The score by Mark Corvin, I believe I'm pronouncing his name right. It's just haunting. It's just so chilling and suits the film so incredibly well. From the opening scene, you get this sense of isolation and dread coming from this incredible score. And this score, it can be very serene at times. When it needs to be a threat, it's a threat. And when it needs to take a backseat and kind of let the sound, the atmosphere of the weather of what's happening outside come into the scene, it does just that. And that's another point I want to bring up. The score and the sound design blend together seamlessly. This experience, if you go to see this film in a theater, you will get one of the best sounding films you will ever hear, because the score complements the sound design complements the score. When the sound design needs to take the stage, it does, and then when the score needs to come in for an intense sequence, it does. Take, for example, the monologue that Willem Dafoe has. There really isn't a score in that scene. It's more like rain and thunder and the storm raging in the background, fueling Willem Dafoe's anger. And then, of course, in the chase sequence where Willem Dafoe chases Thomas with an axe, there's a score. And it's loud, and it's there, and it's like, wow, you're in the action. So that's a brilliant aspect of this film that I love a lot. And just one more thing before I move on to story points. The production design is amazing. They built an actual lighthouse, I believe, for this film, and they actually went to an island, I believe somewhere in Canada. They went, I think it was Nova Scotia. I could be very well mistaken, but they went to an actual island and filmed there in the actual weather and built an actual lighthouse. The conditions in which this crew and cast worked in, it's noticeable in the final film. And it doesn't look fake at all. In fact, I think probably 75% of all the shots in the film were actually filmed during days where the weather was unforgivingly bad. One of my favorite shots in the film is when Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson are waiting for their ride back just after Robert Pattinson's character kills the seagull. They're just kind of waiting in this cold rain and whipping wind, and they're just kind of like Robert Pattinson is shielding himself because he's not used to this, and Willem Dafoe's character is kind of just used to it and just standing there, and they're kind of like moving back and forth slightly. I just love that shot. It's just one of my favorite ones. And I know the weather doesn't really have that much to do with the production design, or it could, they also built the sets in which these characters interact. The props look super realistic. The wardrobe is really good. I really like the wardrobe in this movie. It's very authentic. I saw what they were going for in the behind-the-scenes extras, and they hit the nail right on the head in that area. Also, speaking of storms, a quick reality check. It is starting to get a little windy outside. The wind is whipping slightly. So if you do hear whipping winds, great. That'll add a whole lot more to the Lighthouse episode. Ooh, I'm excited now. Okay. So, with all of those technical aspects out of the way, let's talk about the story of the film and some of the interesting moments that I noticed and some of my comments on what happens. In terms of story points, I would obviously like to talk about the ending first. But I do want to talk about the Thomas/Winslow character progression and the feeling of dread that is just ever so present throughout this entire film. The way Robert Eggers, and Ari Aster for that matter, but Robert Eggers, I'm going to talk about Robert Eggers more. Robert Eggers manages to tell a story that maybe is based on a fairy tale or a folklore tale in such a creative, mesmerizing, and intuitive way. The Witch is no exception, of course, but The Lighthouse takes this up to 100. The Lighthouse is apparently based off of one of Edgar Allan Poe's poems, where it's basically a diary of someone who is stationed at a lighthouse, and he kind of tells what's going on at the lighthouse. Now, what I love about this director's approach to stories is that it's just so Lovecraftian in a way. For those of you who don't know what Lovecraftian means, it's basically Lovecraftian horror. It's a subgenre of horror that basically, it emphasizes the terror and the uncertainty and horror of the unknown, more than just gore or shock value or common tropes that basically slasher horror movies do, or that some supernatural movies do. Lovecraftian horror, it's probably one of my favorite genres, but having this fear of the unknown, it's just something that always fascinated me. And in The Lighthouse, it's basically in the entire ending sequence. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But I love how there's always this greater force or greater wisdom or being that these characters discover that they can't possibly control. And usually it ends up controlling them. Now, this happened with The Witch. Spoilers for The Witch. At the end, Thomasin, the youngest daughter, actually becomes a part of this witch cult, and she just floats up into the sky, and it's an insane ending. Those types of storytelling methods really keep me engaged, really interest me, and it also creates a very dreadful atmosphere. In terms of uncertainty of what's going to happen to these characters, what force will come into play that these characters don't know about, or is there something mythical and just impossible to understand? What will that being, item, thing, force, what will that do to the characters on screen? And it's this story about this enchantment in the light, and how that story and that curiosity of the unknown affects our main protagonist. And while Winslow, or Thomas, I'm just going to call him Thomas from now on because, well, it's revealed that his name is Thomas. And while Thomas is trying to figure these things out, a gull appears before him. And it becomes kind of a bother to Thomas. Like, it keeps appearing. Like, first when he tries to leave the coal, I think, inside of the boiler room, this gull kind of appears in front of him and stops him in his tracks. It's this one-eyed gull. And there's an interesting parallel about that one-eyed gull and the ending shot, which I'll get to in a second. It just keeps appearing. It appears again when Thomas falls after trying to paint the lighthouse. His support breaks and he just falls onto the ground, and he wakes up and the one-eyed gull is picking at his pants. And one last time, the gull appears when, after Thomas tries to get a drink of water, it's just basically like a mixture of I think, seagull blood and like oil. He tries to get a drink and it's just not working. He goes out and he tries to see what the problem is, and he goes to see what the problem is, and there's a dead seagull in this pit where this liquid is. I don't really know how to describe it, but there's a gull down there. And then the one-eyed gull appears, and Thomas basically grabs it and beats it to a bloody pulp. And it was a very shocking sequence. And it's in that point in the film when another suspenseful element comes in, which is the impending doom of this storm. When this storm hits, excuse my French, but shit is going to go down. And combining that with the trying to discover what the secret of the light is plots and the impending storm coming plots, it makes for a very intense and thoroughly entertaining story. And it keeps building and building and building, and things just keep going crazier and crazier and crazier. The storm keeps raging on, and it becomes more intense and just more of an incredible force. It destroys basically everything. It destroys a cottage where Thomas Wick is Willem Dafoe's character, where they're staying. It just destroys everything, and it basically represents the destruction of Thomas's sanity, because he's gone completely bonkers at this point. He's having hallucinations about the man he killed. He just starts having visions and going insane. And of course, one of the visions he has, and I'm just going to talk about this real quick, is the mermaid that was washed up on the shore. And it's one of the most disturbing sequences I've ever seen in a film. And it's not because of, I don't know, it's a freaking mermaid on the beach. It's just because it's so dreamlike and strange. Basically, Thomas goes to have intercourse with this mermaid. But once he discovers that she's a mermaid, the mermaid kind of just laughs at him and mocks him. And as he's terrified out of his mind, it's just this image of this mermaid tossing back her head and laughing. And it's just so strange. It's so bizarre. Mostly because of the sound that the mermaid makes that I can't possibly hope to replicate with my voice. But it's that siren-like laugh that just deeply unsettled me. And the movement of the mermaid also was just kind of strange, just to see this humanoid-like creature washed up on the shore. It's one of the few films, I think, that actually depicts mermaids as more terrifying than they're usually depicted as. Basically, it's not how mermaids are depicted in, let's just say, for example, Disney movies or animated movies. It's a more unsettling interpretation of a mermaid, and I love it. It's really effective. But let's get back on track to the eventual ending of this film. And all this dread that has been building up until this point, Thomas finally, he basically kills Thomas Wick with an axe, and he basically recites the little toast dialogue that Willem Dafoe does before a toast throughout the movie. He does that and basically toasts to Willem Dafoe's dead body, and I found that parallel fairly amusing. Thomas is basically going up to find out what secret this light has. What is the secret within the light? What's the enchantment? What's this all about? What? And in The Witch, Thomason kind of does a deal with the devil, and she goes to see what the witch's cult is all about, in a way. So there's a couple parallels between those two scenes. So Thomas goes up to the top of the lighthouse, and the lighthouse basically opens up to him. We see that the door to the light opens, and he gazes inside, and we get probably one of the most terrifying sequences I've ever seen in a movie. It's one of the most effective horror movie endings as well that I've ever seen. It's just otherworldly in terms of horror. We see this man gazing into the light, and he just goes absolutely insane. Robert Pattinson just does such an amazing job in this scene. And the thing that scares me the most about this scene is that the screams that Thomas delivers, that Robert Pattinson delivers, they're distorted. And I find that unsettling because during this entire film, it's kind of it's basically a period piece. This is the early 19th century. Audio distortion was not even invented yet. And throughout this entire film, it's basically, you're so sucked into this world that when you hear distorted audio, it feels alien to the atmosphere of the movie. It feels alien to the crisp sounds and the totally realistic depiction of this time period. So when I heard that distorted scream, it was just, it left me in shock. It was just, I have no words for it. It's one of the most terrifying scenes I've ever seen in a movie. And there was a question that was for the Q&A section, but I'm going to include it right here because I think it's a perfect transition. It's, what do you think Thomas saw in the lights at the end of the movie? And I found this question very interesting. It's obviously the question you would propose to yourself. I found Robert Eggers' answer very interesting. He basically said, if you had seen what he saw, you'd have suffered the same fate. If that isn't one of the best ways to describe this ending, I don't know what is. Well, I mean, it's not one of the best ways, it's the best way. It's what the director said, but I'm still going to give my own thoughts on what he saw. And what I really think it is, it's kind of like Belloc looking into the Ark in Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's like Thomas saw something so inexplicable that it pushed him past insanity, and it basically destroyed him. Like, of course, Belloc's head explodes, but Thomas's head doesn't explode, obviously. But he just goes absolutely insane because of what he saw and because of what he was exposed to. Or maybe he wasn't exposed to anything, or he didn't see anything at all. Another comparison can be made from the briefcase from Pulp Fiction. We see Vincent open it up, and he kind of just looks at it. He doesn't go insane or anything, he just kind of gazes, and it's like, wow, it's this. It's kind of like that in a way, but in a horror movie. And the consequences are a lot more dire. And I think that maybe Thomas only just saw light in the lighthouse. He just didn't see anything. He didn't see he just didn't see enchantment. He didn't see anything, and his mind just snapped. And that's why the screams are distorted. But the screams could also be distorted because, well, there's just some Lovecraftian otherworldly power that is inside this light. And what does this mean, folks? Yes, once again, one of my favorite ways to end a movie is an open ending. And there is an open ending in terms of what Thomas saw in the lighthouse. Of course, the actual ending shot is of Thomas having his liver pecked out by a ton of seagulls. As the camera slowly dollies backward, we see that, well, he's just lying down, bloodied on some rocks, with one of his eyes taken out. Just like the gull he killed, his eye was just completely gone. I found that to be a very interesting parallel. And, well, that's how the movie ends. We see Thomas getting his liver pecked. And another thing that I found that was very interesting was that you don't really see the lighthouse in the final shot of the movie. Just something to think about. I'm not going to comment on it, but you guys think about that. You just don't see the lighthouse in the final shot of the movie. Which is strange. So there's a lot of ways this ending has been interpreted. There's the whole Prometheus theory that, first of all, the Prometheus story was that Prometheus stole fire, and then he was condemned to a mountain where a bird would peck from his liver, and the bird represented Zeus, and it's this whole thing. And a lot of people have compared that to the lighthouse, because Thomas basically sins and gets to the light in basically the easy way. So he's forever destined to have his liver pecked by seagulls. But one explanation that I find interesting, I saw this, I can't remember for the life of me on what video I saw it from, but I saw this comment saying that the island in which the lighthouse is situated with Thomas Wick and Thomas, it serves as purgatory. And the lighthouse, the light going up those stairs is kind of like the stairway to heaven, right? It's the way out. And you can get there in a certain way that's good, but Thomas doesn't go the good way. And eventually in purgatory, he basically pays for his sins, and he's basically condemned to suffering for the rest of his life by having his body picked at by seagulls on the very island that served as his purgatory. And I thought that was very interesting. I honestly cannot give my final opinion or thoughts on what the ending actually means. I have to see this film a third time. I've only seen it twice, and the rewatchability value on this film is it's through the roof. You can catch so many things or understand new things on multiple rewatches, which is probably what I'm going to do. Because on my second watch, I already caught on a ton of details that I hadn't noticed. And just to wrap The Lighthouse up, this is just one of the best films I've ever seen. It's brilliantly shot. It's got outstanding performances. The direction is just absolutely amazing. It's just a gem. It's a gem. It's a classic. It's a masterpiece. The Lighthouse is a masterpiece. It absolutely gets a 5 out of 5 stars. Absolutely. So in terms of wrapping up The Lighthouse, it's an exquisite film. It oozes with originality and creativity and just pure filmmaking at its best. So getting into the one question for a Q&A section. Sorry, but in order to keep time down to the wire, I gotta do this one question. The question is, are there any movies you didn't care about that much the first time around, but then the tone or score or any other elements drew you in to watch it again? That's a really good question. Alright, let's see. I have 2 answers for this question. Actually, 3. One film that I didn't really pay much attention to at first, but then I've discovered is just masterful, is the film Arrival. It's from 2017. It has Amy Adams, Jeremy Renner. It's directed by Denis Villeneuve. I cannot pronunciate his name for the life of me. I'll try to every time I do, but I'm always going to get it wrong somehow. That film is it's incredible. It's one of the best sci-fi and one of the best... It's just an amazing movie. I can't talk any more about it because it's like The Lighthouse. It's very spoiler-centered, and you got to pay a lot of attention to it, and it's really good. But another film that I didn't really pay much attention to was Punch Drunk Love. I saw it the first time, and I was like, yeah, that was all right. Me back in, 2018. I basically saw it, and then I saw it the second time, and I was just blown away. It's just amazing. Adam Sandler gives an amazing performance, and it's Paul Thomas Anderson, and it's just it's so good. And finally, one more film, Chef. It's directed by Jon Favreau. It's basically about this guy who has this food truck service, and he tours the country with his son. And it's a very heartwarming and really feel-good movie. I watched it the first time, and I thought that was fun. That was awesome. And I just didn't really like the soundtrack. I loved the movie, but I didn't really like the soundtrack. And then I listened to the soundtrack just by itself one day, and I was like, hey, these songs are actually really catchy. And then I watched the movie again. I'm like, okay, I'm just singing aloud to these songs. These are just amazing. So, and one more. Oh, yeah, there's one more. The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. That's another one. That's just... It's a really good movie. Ben Stiller, he directed and acted in it. It just has a great soundtrack. I just didn't catch the soundtrack the first time around. I thought the movie was great, but the soundtrack, I was like, I don't really get it. But then I listened to the soundtrack now, probably a couple years after I saw the movie initially, and it was just so much better. Just sounds a lot better. And those are the movies where my opinion has changed on the second watch about the score or the tone, or how the tone or the score drew me in. I would suggest to anyone who has ever seen a movie and felt bored with it to give that movie another watch, because you may discover something that you didn't know was there. But with those words of wisdom, this has been the 19th episode of James and the Frames. one of my favorite episodes that I've done to date because, well, talking about The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is just amazing. And next week, I will definitely do a more lighthearted film. I've been going with a lot of, the past 2 episodes, I've had some pretty intense movies. So I'll try to go with something more lighthearted next week. And I'll let you guys know, of course, on the Instagram post and in the YouTube descriptions what it's going to be. Also, I'm working on another YouTube video besides the Nightcrawler video. It's about the way some of these modern horror movies are ended. Among those titles are The Witch, The Lighthouse, and Hereditary. And I will talk about that in a YouTube video. And I'm excited to share that with you guys. But for now, this has been the 19th episode of James and the Frames. I hope you all enjoyed listening. And if you have any other opinions or comments about The Lighthouse, just hit me up on Instagram or leave a comment in the YouTube video. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. But until then, I will see you after the credits.